It's been several years since Venezuela transitioned into a full dictatorship. With Chavez and then Maduro, the Venezuelan government became intolerant to dissent, eroded all semblances of democratic institutions, manipulated the law, and drove the country's economy to ruin, all with the help of surveillance technology. Good morning, I'm Jason Marzek, Vice President and Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arst Latin America Center, and thanks for tuning in to Still Watching How Venezuela Deploys Surveillance to Maintain Political Control. On January 3rd, when Maduro was removed, Venezuelans around the world became cautiously hopeful that there would be lasting, meaningful change and that their country would be free again. Important inroads have been made, with growing investor interest as well since that time. But freedom doesn't come when the state knows your every move through its extensive surveillance. Video monitoring systems, telecommunications interception, cyber patrolling, state-sponsored digital applications, device searches and seizures, drone surveillance, cyber attacks. This all continues in Venezuela. And while a democratic transition in Venezuela is possible, it is an incredibly complex process that requires the conscious dismantling of institutions that upheld Maduro's authoritarian regime, including the surveillance technologies we are here to discuss today. With attention focused on the importance of stabilizing and then reactivating the Venezuelan economy, this timely report calls attention to how political surveillance infrastructure continues to operate, as well as some of the nefarious actors behind it. You're going to learn in today's show more about how this surveillance continues to operate and what are steps needed to take as a result. I encourage listeners to read this incredibly timely and important report called Watch the Watchers, Surveillance Technologies for Political Control in Post-Maduro Venezuela. It is authored by my Atlantic Council colleague, Iria Poyosa, as well as Andres Aspura, founder of Conexión Segura y Libre, which is a digital rights organization that defends human rights online. Here at the Atlantic Council, we are committed to a prosperous, free, and democratic Venezuela. At the Adrian Arst Latin America Center, we have launched Venezuela Forward, where we cut through the uncertainty on Venezuela's future and provide cutting-edge analysis on the future of the country. Iria, one of today's co-authors, is a frequent speaker at our events, and it's a pleasure to be here today introducing this DFR Lab new report. One message that you'll hopefully come away with today is the following. Surveillance systems need to be dismantled for those in Venezuela to be able to freely express their opinions and live without fear of constant monitoring. Before I hand the conversation over, I'd like to give a welcome to the speakers as part of today's event. Gina Romero, UN Special Rapporteur to the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Freedom of Association. Bill Marzek, Senior Research Fellow at Citizen Lab. I don't think we have any direct family linkages, although we share a last name. And the authors of the report, Andres Aspura and Iria Poyosa. I also encourage those watching today's show to please go ahead and submit questions using askac.org, and they'll be incorporated into today's conversation. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Beth Curley. Beth is a senior program officer who manages research and convening on emerging tech risks and opportunities and defends democracy's fundamental freedoms for the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. So with that, I leave it over to you, Beth, for captaining today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Jason, and it's delightful to be here to talk through a piece of really cutting-edge and thorough research on this critical topic of digital surveillance and physical surveillance using digital tools in Venezuela. To kick off the conversation today, I'd like to turn things over first to the report co-author, Andres Aspura, to walk us through some of the top order findings, and then we will dig deeper into some of the specific points and implications with the all-star lineup that we have here today. So Andres. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you everyone for joining this conversation. So a key finding is that the surveillance apparatus continues to be in effect and working even after the leadership change in January 3rd. The surveillance apparatus has many different areas of work or different domains of operation. All of them interconnect and help them operate as an integrated system, even though data sharing is not always integrated on a automated basis. But the different legs of the system make the system more effective as a whole than just individual parts of them. A very significant part is the surveillance, telecommunications surveillance, for which is completely and a tremendously high amount of telecommunications interception. We estimate between 20 to 25% of all phone lines in Venezuela have been subject to data extraction or interception by authorities, including geolocation. This comes from basically the only real number that we have from this is a transparency report from Telefonica, the parent company of one of our actually the largest mobile operator in the country, which share data on all the markets they work and the different government requests. And yeah, over 20% of all their subscriber lines were subject to this in 2021. And that's the latest number we have. We have to assume everything is even worse, for example, for the state-owned mobile operator. We also know of the very likely presence of IMSI catchers or cell tower simulators to also have more direct real-time access to location data. The CCTV systems in Venezuela have grown tremendously. In the second half of 2025, there was a 78% increase in the CCTV surveillance cameras operated by VEN 911 by the state, by the national government's surveillance system that is also connected to emergency response like 911. We do know that these systems are not the only ones, because we also were able to document the growing presence of additional systems owned and operated by local governments, municipal governments, or regional state level governments, all of which cooperate and share data with the national authorities. We also have extremely concerning reports of how that information was used in political operations and sometimes how it was suppressed, so that evidence of, for example, raids by repressive security forces was not recorded on those municipal systems. And the growth of those systems is increasingly high, and the command and control systems of those CCTV deployments are quite sophisticated, using state-of-the-art Hikvision systems that include AI, facial recognition, natural language descriptors, so that they can find people just by describing them. And we don't know the data retention policies or usage policies for this, how they prevent abuse. And for all we know is that abuse is happening, at least on the political repression. There's also extensive system of license plate readers in all entries and exits of major cities, and reports from citizens confirm that people feel surveilled, and that affects their capacity to participate in public life, they second guess whether they're going to attend protests or activities because they feel surveilled by all of these systems, not only CCTV, also by their possibility of being geolocated and other systems, including drones. We were able to document, and this is the first report, some of the drone models that are in operation by different security forces who have been publicly reported. Most of them, all of them are Chinese brands. The report focuses only on surveillance drones, not on other like military-oriented drones, because that's not part of the scope or our mission. So we're talking about drones being operated by security, civil intelligence, and sometimes military parts of the government, but that have a public safety or crowd control responsibilities as well. And some of these drones are very sophisticated with 30x zoom. Some of them are fixed wing VTOL systems from Autel Robotics, our Chinese brand, and they also have DJI systems, but they tend to be used more on a tactical unit level instead of strategic surveillance kind of capabilities. We have also documented the use of GPS trackers installed outside and inside of the vehicles of families of political prisoners. In this case, political prisoners of their families seem to be the most important target, and the ones connected into the vehicles were all wired into the vehicle's electrical system to ensure the systems continue to report the families or the victims' locations, and so that the authorities can continue to have access to conversations that are being held inside of the vehicle. A significant finding is also the extensive use of government apps that require and requests very sensitive information, not only of the user, but also of their friends and their families and their connections. We were not able to find actively malicious code or uses in this app, but the privacy concerns of these applications are tremendous, and their use for social and political control is evident. Also, we also saw some techniques to try to make analysis of the applications harder. So that's also a significant finding. Importantly, the Ven app, an application that was originally sold as a kind of local self-made super app in Venezuela, ended up very visibly becoming a state-owned application with one of the major primary uses was denouncing and snitching on neighbors and dissidents in the country. The application was taken off the Play Store and the App Store after this revelation, but the application continues to operate as a web app, and we have screenshots of how the app currently looks and how people can report their neighbors. Cyber patrolling or social media surveillance is and continues to be a very significant threat to freedom of expression, as people feel surveilled, and that there are very real risks to expressing online and expressing dissent, especially in times of political uncertainty. It continues to be illegal, for example, to celebrate or share positive opinions of the events in January 3rd, and like that surveillance on social media is a huge risk on people who could be expressing their own personal opinions, and those opinions could be interpreted as supporting the U.S. actions in January 3rd. Continuing on this trend, not only do we have this surveillance, we have also those systems to report and snitch on people expressing themselves online. And we also seen, like we have reported in the past, both the DFR Lab and Vesinfiltro, how independently how those cases of people expressing themselves online or those expressions being recorded online led to arrests and very visible videos with intention of intimidating others, so that they also will not dare to speak out on either online or in public spaces. So we have several cases in which people were charged with terrorism and hate crimes just for expressing themselves online or having those expressions becoming viral on the internet, and getting extremely onerous sentences of 30 years, 25 years for some of these things. And the specific cases are listed in the report. They're interesting read. Most of those cases have been excarcelated through recent actions on the Venezuelan government to lower that political pressure, but still it's extremely concerning, and those things could like that legal framework that supported all of those actions continues to be in place. Device seizures is an extremely significant problem, especially after January 3rd, where it became extremely common for authorities to require on the spot in the streets access to the phones, not only accessing phone calls, accessing photos, their social media accounts that were logged in the phone at the time, but also getting into WhatsApp, and inside of WhatsApp, searching for specific keywords and putting people at risk of either detention or extortion by the officers performing those illegal searches. In the case of border or airports, those searches tend to be more targeted and led to interrogations in which the devices were unlocked, searched with the presence of the victim, but then the device is unlocked, while unlocked, taken to a different office for further analysis. In one case, one civil rights activist had their Gmail account compromised after this event, and she got an email from Google that is consistent with malicious activity on the phone, likely a session hijacking and automated scraping or downloading of contents of those devices. The screenshots and the specific cases for that are also described in the report. Venezuela also has access to forensic data extraction tools such as Celebrite. Likely they also have other brands, but we know for a fact that they do have Celebrite devices. And it's even called chupacabra by victims of political repression that have in some instances even seen the device, in most cases just seeing transcripts of their own conversations captured from Celebrite UFED touch devices, or as commonly called in Venezuela, the chupacabra. And we also document several cases of cyber attacks, state-sponsored cyber attacks against dissidents. In some cases, these are widespread phishing attacks against hundreds of thousands, perhaps, of dissidents. Sometimes it's hard to estimate the actual impact. Sometimes we have some information about it. In some instances, the fact that the government has their own ISP has been part of these sophisticated phishing attacks, in which they manipulate internet traffic so that they can force some requests so that they go to malicious servers, even if the victim of the phishing attack had been typing the correct URL. So it's not just the standard phishing where someone tricks you into clicking the fake domain or fake URL or to do something secure. It's like you're traveling to the actual correct authentic website, or that's what you think because you type the correct URL. But even despite that, you're sent to the wrong, to malicious website. We've also seen hacking or unauthorized access to WhatsApp and Signal accounts of users, despite not seeing any evidence of a phishing attack being committed. So we can assume that's SMS interception being at play here for that account hijacking, and other cases of attempted unsuccessful account takeovers or illegal access to accounts after very public speeches or after detention or after excarceration of several people. In general, to conclude, this apparatus is extremely wide, extremely high, long-reaching, and people do feel the effects of it. People will say how they feel surveilled, how they, in some communities, they feel that it's a recurrent problem or preoccupation of them, how there are frequently drones flying overhead, and sometimes the government makes these kinds of surveillance very discreet so that people don't know it's happening, and sometimes they make it very visible so that people are afraid, and there's a chilling effect on people's actions and opinions.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive overview of, again, what is a very detailed report. And I think that gives our audience a sense of just the sheer scope and range of the different instruments, the different places as someone moves through their daily life where they might be tracked, whether that's by drones, by interception of their calls, by monitoring of digital communications, cameras in the public square, and just how challenging it might be to avoid surveillance of this kind that's so pervasive, and that in the case of some of these cyber attacks doesn't necessarily require the user to be making any mistake. They are just taking advantage of their control over the infrastructure. So I think a few points that really came through. I mean, first, again, this is everywhere. It can monitor where people go. It can monitor kind of the sanctity and privacy, break the sanctity and privacy of their calls. It can map their associations. There are not the absence of guardrails, of democratic judicial guardrails, whether those govern the circumstances of surveillance or what happens to the data after it's collected is really a theme that comes through in this report, and the political nature of the surveillance, which you can see from the queries and some of those keyword searches you mentioned, or who's being targeted, where the surveillance is directed. And so to kind of help go a step further in unpacking just what this means politically, I'd like to turn to Iria and specifically to think about kind of how this all fits together. So Iria, one topic that you and I have discussed a number of times is where data integration fits into digital authoritarianism and digital repression strategies, and kind of makes the sum greater than the or the total greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so in the case of the various Venezuelan surveillance technologies, should we be looking at these as a loosely coordinated ecosystem of different capabilities, or is there a central command and control node? How do these all fit together?
Sorry. Thank you, Beth. And I would say it's complicated uh, because there are several streams of data that have been captured by the authorities. And in some cases, as you say, it's loosely connected. There's no hard evidence of technical integration of those streams, but there are some ways in which that data can be and may have been integrated. Major sources, major pillars of the surveillance apparatus are Bank 911. It was the structure for the deployment of the CCTV cameras across the countries. That is a national level deployment. There is a high concentration in the capital city in Caracas, but there are also deployments in the regional and local level who are articulated and integrated with Bank 911. There is also the Patria system, the Homeland system, with a database of databases about population level, individual level, and family level data about behavior, identity. So that is the second pillar of the apparatus, and the third pillar is something Andres was describing in some detail, is the intersection of communications, but state-owned telecommunication company Cantebe and all the other private providers in the countries who are under the forced to provide that information to the state. So those three I'm calling pillars, but those three structures are not strictly technical integrated. They work in parallel, but there are ways in which authorities can access all of this data. Some of the solutions the Chinese technology providers offer for a government allow the integration of data from several streams. We are uncertain of to what level that integration is used on a day-to-day basis by authorities. It's more the technical capability is there. It's possible to integrate those data from these different streams, but we don't know exactly how they do that in every day. How is the bureaucratic routine for doing that? There is a little known agency who actually its mandate was exactly to integrate information from several sources to provide that information for security and intelligence analysis. It was the CESPA. The CESPA was a structure under the president of the Republic, so the most higher level possible. This organization, the Strategic Center for Security and Protection of the Homeland, it would be the full name, was the space in which the political police, civilian, and the military intelligence agency, DESIN, at the opportunity to request and revise every data, every piece of data the state gather for different sources. So even some bureaucratic sources like taxes or civil registration, and some of these the surveillance string. All the data was centralized at the CESPA, and it was at the disposition of the political police and the military police, so they can use all that information. So that was the institutional space on the integration happened. Although it was a technical integration to our knowledge, maybe it's possible it exists, but we don't have the evidence. But there was an institutional space in which that happened. This ESPA was just defunded a couple of weeks ago. Well, I consider one of the most significant changes we have seen in the Venezuelan surveillance apparatus and intelligence apparatus in the last decade. So it's very consequential, but little known way in which this information is used and integrated for intelligence purposes.
Thanks, Maria. So we're not sure of the exact technical approach that's being used here, but we are clearly, we have evidence that these different bureaucratic institutions have been looking at coordination mechanisms and that there is access to these data streams that could be used for purposes of political repression and almost certainly are being used for purposes of political repression. Quickly, before I move on, would you just, on the subject of integration, do you maybe want to say a quick word about the integration of political coercion and then control of the social welfare system in the form of the Patria system?
Sure. The Patria system is it was conceived as a way to gather data of individuals for the purpose of political control. That was the specific goal for this database. The way people were lured to provide their data is voluntary. So you register in the Homeland system, in the Patria system, because you want to. But you want to register there because the Patria systems allows you to buy subsidized food. And it was the system was released. The launch of the Patria system was at the early mid of 2016, when Venezuela was having hyperinflation and shortage of food. So really, for the population in poverty at that moment was rising, the only way to get access to food was to register in Patria. There are also some discretionary cash transfers who are distributed using the Patria system. It was also it's a connection with this information propaganda and information operation systems, because the volunteers who were in the troops, the cyber troops spreading propaganda for the regime, were paid through the Patria system. Elder people who are retired and had their elder pension from the state, earned by their work, year life work, the only way they can claim that benefit is by being registered in the Patria system. 2020 took a huge intake of the people who until then have been resisted to join the database, needed to do it because gas for the cars, gas was subsidized via Patria system. And more important than that, COVID vaccination was only available to those who were registered in the Patria system. So it is voluntary. So it's not allowed to force you to register there. But the only way you can access to welfare, and in some case vital things like COVID vaccines, is by being registered. So that forced people to register. And even more, the system is constantly asking for more data, is continuous or requesting people to update their consumption habits. There are weekly surveys about what you buy in the supermarket this week, what medicines you need in a regular basis, what chronic illness you had. It's not only the individual, it's the household. So you are filling your personal information, you have to fill the other people in your household, even those who didn't want to be part of Patria. More recently, they are starting to request information about your relatives who migrated. So you had to provide, so the person who is registered in Patria are forced, compelled to provide information about relatives who are no longer living in the country, but may plan to return. That made basically every Venezuelan is in the Patria system, and they can map the connections between the people who is related with. Well, some of the information you need to provide is who is the street boss of the party in the neighborhood in which you live, so they know who is the person who is in charge of physically surveil you in next door house. So all that information may the behavior of the people being constrained, because people know the authorities, their street boss, the one who manages the database, know a lot of information is vital for them as individuals and for their family members. So that had been had an effect on voting behavior. It had an effect in willingness to participate in electoral mobilization. It had an effect in willingness to participate in protests. So it's a very effective way to control the population.
Thanks. So the appearance of just getting people to choose to submit their data, but of course there's no real choice in a context where people may be dependent on that system for subsistence, and the direct linkage of that data hungry system to the distribution of benefits and to kind of incentives to participate in regime controlled political activity, all really critical points there. I want to turn now to Bill Marsack from Citizen Lab, which Citizen Lab has really done, I would say, world-leading research on the challenge of spyware deployment against activists, journalists, members of civil society, people who annoy governments through their peaceful expression around the world. And that's a challenge, of course, that we've seen in many different settings, not just in hard autocracies. This report looks at a number of signs of at least the Venezuelan government showing interest in acquiring spyware systems, and a couple instances of apparent infection, but it can often be challenging to map these deployments precisely because of the opacity that surrounds these deals, and perhaps harder in a closed setting. So what do we know about where spyware fits in to Venezuela's particular ecosystem of digital repression, and how would you describe some of the challenges to doing forensic research on that topic in this kind of setting?
Thanks, Beth. That's a great question. I think in the case of Venezuela, what we've seen is that there have been these hints, right, of spyware being used, but it's difficult to fully substantiate and attribute and understand precisely its role. By nature, spyware is opaque. Spyware being, some sort of app that the government or some other attacker might try and install on someone's phone or computer to exfiltrate, private information. So to spy on, your signal calls, record your WhatsApp messages, things like this, and send it back to the operator of the spyware. I think there's a number of reasons why we haven't seen, the same extent or haven't yet documented, I should say, the same extent of spyware use in Venezuela that we have in other repressive countries. I think, firstly, the kind of like sanctions and economic reasons make some spyware sales. Obviously that you're going to find some spyware companies that are willing to do business with anyone, but some spyware companies at least have some, customer standards, right, about who they'll do business with. And these might be dictated by laws or treaties or things like this. So anytime you have a government which is, I would say, exists outside of the normal kind of international, order of things, you're going to have a challenge in finding a spyware company that's willing to do a deal there. That's not to say there aren't any. There will be some, but you're going to reduce the number of potential sellers of the sort of technology. At the same time, those same reasons make the detection a little bit more tricky because of sanctions and economic reasons. It's a little bit the space for civil society and the linkage between Venezuelan civil society and international civil society is not necessarily as strong as it is in some other places. So if you look at some of the Citizen Lab's past reporting, one of the ways that we do these investigations is we'll work with local civil society in the context of the country who will assist in establishing trust and working on some of the technical aspects of the research. So the limited space for civil society and limited capacity and limited connections there can be a challenge for detection. I think also, given the context of Venezuela and the sort of what are the population of devices like phones, computers that the government might seek to monitor domestically. And I think, again, given economic reasons, these are probably likely to be slightly older devices. So the government, should they want to spy on them, doesn't necessarily need to go out and get like the latest and greatest technology, right? They might be able to rely on slightly older techniques, slightly older exploits or spyware, which, in some cases, you might be able to, download for free or at very low cost vulnerabilities or spyware that might work for older versions of devices, given that those vulnerabilities have been patched or fixed in newer versions of devices. I think also, given the domestic focus or the primarily domestic focus that we've seen of the surveillance apparatus, there's already a number of ways that the government can exercise pretty good domestic control and exercise and obtain domestic monitoring capabilities without resorting to physically, hacking and installing an agent or a spyware program on a device, right? So there's pretty good, pretty extensive telecom network surveillance, CCTV, tracking of movements, social control, physical searches on the street. You can get a ton of mileage that way if you're a government seeking to obtain people's private information. You might not necessarily need to resort to the same scale of use of spyware if you have all these other things already in place, right? A lot of the cases that we've documented of extensive spyware abuse, there might be kind of more space for in those contexts, in those countries, more space for private companies to do, be involved in the telecommunications network in ways where they might not, immediately or automatically cooperate with the government to the same extent. So I think, given all the other ways that the Venezuelan government is doing surveillance, it's not necessarily a surprise that spyware is not at the top of their list. That said, I think there are interesting cases to be discovered of spyware being used, but the detection challenges I highlighted earlier have been a barrier so far. But we'll see. Maybe we'll be able to find some more cases in the future.
Right, thanks, Bill. And yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess spyware is primarily a way of sort of hacking in through some kind of backdoor to digital infrastructure that you don't control. But when you have a certain level of control over the base level of digital infrastructure, then you have public options, as it were, to get at the information that you want. To start thinking through the implications of this really comprehensive surveillance dragnet, I want to turn to Gina Romero, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of assembly and association. And the report documents many different types of surveillance that have clear relationships, for instance, to mapping participation in protest, identifying protesters, knowing when people are gathering, knowing who they are associating with, whether that's through location tracking, through communications monitoring, facial recognition, et cetera. And so what impacts do these and other surveillance tactics that we've discussed have in practice, even if there's not an official ban, on people's ability to meaningfully exercise the freedoms of assembly and association? And what do international human rights principles have to say about this?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I really welcome this timely conversation, and congrats on such a comprehensive report. I actually will be presenting a report to the Human Rights Council next June, drawing on a global study I conducted related to the restriction of freedom of assembly and of association rights due to pervasive surveillance, with a focus on the chilling effects that the surveillance ecosystem we have in most countries now that have been adopted under a securitization narrative that in many cases is being weaponized against dissent and the exercise of rights, even in democracies. But now, in authoritarian contexts like in Venezuela, where surveillance infrastructure has been part of and exploited for advancing the state's repression policy, the impact on freedom of assembly and of association rights is even wider. Actually, my global research reveals a common systemic pattern showing that indeed fear or real or perceived surveillance, including the fear of being identified by the participation in a protest and the severity of consequences of this identification of the surveillance, does create a widespread and long-lasting chilling effect on the right of freedom of assembly and of association rights, which deters people from effectively exercising the freedoms and prevents and suppresses a freedom of association and assembly rights, as it is easy to see for what Andres and the others have mentioned. So the use of technology in the context of peaceful assemblies, including protests, but not only protests, under international human rights law, it must be for the explicit purpose of facilitating the right of peaceful assembly and not for imposing under restrictions, such as, for example, through digital surveillance. And also there are some recommendations in documents and reports made by my mandate that peaceful assembly must not be taken as an opportunity for surveillance. And this is something that is being violated in most countries, but for sure, as all the information that the reports included is specifically in Venezuela being used against the people who actually go to participate in assemblies. Indiscriminate mass and arbitrary digital surveillance are often employed to deliberately intimidate and chill peaceful protesters, and this is clearly the case in Venezuela. And any use of technology in the context of peaceful protest, including political rallies or any other type of assemblies, must be in line with the requirements of legality, necessity in democratic society, and proportionality, and then must be strictly justified and deployed only when strictly necessary of a case-by-case basis. But then we see that in most of the cases, and in Venezuela, we may have like a ton of evidence on this, the use of pervasive surveillance failed to fulfill these requirements, especially necessity in a democratic society and proportionality, because per se, the pervasive surveillance is disproportionate. So this is indiscriminate or disproportionate use of digital surveillance and the misuse of surveillance for intimidation, stigmatization, and criminalization creates a chilling effect that discourages people from exercising the freedoms. But at the same time, it's being used to, as it was mentioned before, to detain, to actually prosecute and attack the different actors that are being part of the protest, even that they are being subjected to violence. And then the international human rights law, when the state's monitoring goes beyond what is provided by law and what is necessary and what is used to identify or intimidate participants before, during, or after a public gathering, would always constitute a violation of the right. Also, it is not only the use of surveillance to deter the participation of different actors, but then also the indiscriminate collection and storage of surveillance data of all participants in, for example, a protest or a political rally or other assembly, regardless of whether they are suspected of being part of a crime or violating any other provision, is actually a very open violation of assembly rights. And also the use of such data for indiscriminate profiling, creating watch lists without suspicion of discriminatory or on their discriminatory basis. For example, when targeted specific groups based on their viewpoints or their past behavior in, for example, the participation on other protests or rallies, violates also the principle of non-discrimination and also violates the assembly rights. And then specifically on the issue of drones, that is something that it was mentioned. Drones create even a wider problem. So all the surveillance is that the ecosystem of surveillance that is being used is creating a state of terror for people to actually exercise the right of peaceful assembly, including to go into protest. But in the case of drones, it's even worse because many surveillance tactics are not easy to see. So if you have something in your mobile, you have a spyware like the chupacabra that we're mentioning, it is not easy to see that is there. Or if somebody reports you in an app, you don't know what is happening. If your phone is being tracked or your plate license is being tracked, you don't know that is happening. But then you do see when the drone is going up, actually following your steps or following some other people. So these increase the fears and chills the effects. And in its effects, we have been reporting that it's wars of youth and children and all those actors that have a political intent for participation in different types of assemblies. And then at the end, the affectation of the freedom of assembly rights are in the present, because then it has been actually been used to target it and detain and curtail the rights for certain individuals, but it's creating also a future, and it's affecting the sustainability of the exercise of the right precisely for the chilling effects on the use of these surveillance tools.
Thanks very much for that thorough explanation of the many violations of international human rights principles that we see in connection with these applications of surveillance, both in terms of the direct use to target participants in what should be free assembly activity for arrest and detention, but also in terms of this broader state of terror. I think that's a really critical piece that comes through the whole report. And in some cases where clearly it seems like the government sometimes wants people to know that they're being watched. And there was another example that was in here about cameras being kind of specifically stationed outside a protest vigil and pointed at the participants, and also the before, during, and after. So it's not just the direct surveillance of protests that contributes to this chilling effect, but it really is this entire wider indiscriminate surveillance that is so thoroughly documented in this report. I want to turn back to Andres to dig a little deeper into the cyber element of this report. So we heard from Bill some interest in spyware, but it seems like maybe that's not the #1 priority for Venezuela's surveillance per se. However, the report also does look at malware more broadly and a whole host of cyber attacks, some of which you mentioned. So how would you describe the kind of overall strategy pursued by the regime in terms of using cyber as an instrument of political control, and what are the entities involved in these efforts? You're muted.
A lot of what we discussed applies also for the cyber element. For example, some of the more widespread cyber attacks or cyber threats, like phishing campaigns against dissidents and activists who wanted to register to participate in specific politically oriented activities, get phished so that they register on the malicious state government-owned servers, so that the government has the list of the people who intended to join these activities, but also that limits the capacity to actually join others in collective action, limiting their own rights to association as well. But the thing is, they also try to make the impact of this as public as possible. So it also becomes like this, they already know everything, or it contributes to this learned helplessness of people who think, oh, this little we can do at this stage because the government controls so much and they already have access to everything. So why join? Why participate? But other things have been far more stealthier and easier to publicly document. There's a very clear intention of obtaining and using spyware in Venezuela, but it tracks with what Bill was saying, that we don't have this specific case where we're able to document, so this brand or this specific software family was used against this specific dissidents. We have had many cases in which we believe spyware was being used, but we were not able to fully document because we didn't have access to the device for multiple reasons, or we couldn't continue to explore it. However, there's multiple things we have documented in the report, including approaches to multiple different spyware vendors, some via sources, some that are public out there, and an Atlantic and a Citizen Lab report that showed the presence of a specific server, a specific command and control server in Venezuela for a spyware family. The thing is that we still don't have like the other part, like who was attacked. So the government could claim, for example, that this was a demo or a demonstration. But there's this, in fact, server that was found by Citizen Lab of a specific brand. So we have multiple brands, multiple vendors being contacted and approached, at the very least, for spyware. And yeah, we also seen, as I said, social media account takeovers. We have seen communication platforms account takeovers, including Signal and WhatsApp, without any evidence of phishing. So it's not like someone called you and tricked you into giving, I don't know, the verification codes or something like that. It's like there's no evidence of that ever happening. How they got access to it? Well, there are multiple possibilities, but the most likely one is SMS interception. We also have other cases where it's possible that in a context where a lot of cyber attacks are WhatsApp account takeovers from criminal actors, that the state actors could also be hiding among those criminal actors using the same like scripts, so that it's harder to document what actually happened. And I mean, there have been multiple cases where we believe that also happened. And as I said, specific like I don't know, fake Gmail login websites, fake Twitter back then login websites that we were able to attribute to the government. So it's not just like, oh, there's just some phishing attacks that are happening like everywhere else. It's like, no, this specifically we were able to attribute to the government on infrastructure shared with other state-sponsored cyber attacks that we're also able to attribute to the government. And it's very widespread, and it's as recent as for example, the election campaign for the 2024 presidential elections. We saw the hacking and the exposure of data from one of the major opposition political parties. So their like mobilization database was hacked and partially leaked online, and some passwords were shared online so others could also access to it. Again, this is made very visible by the government, also to create fear and uncertainty and lack of trust to the opposition initiatives. And a different one, fake phishing attacks, phishing campaigns with fake websites trying to collect people who wanted to register as activists for the opposition election campaign. So they had a lookalike Google Forms with fake social media accounts promoting the fake Google Forms so that people will register their own intention to collaborate with the opposition campaign, but they will end up registering on a government-owned Google Forms that thankfully was eventually stopped, but also exposing people's identities and intentions to the government.
So that duality of create fear and undermine trust, I think, terribly important in thinking about the impact of these strategies, because on the one hand, okay, there's the government might respond harshly to my engagement in civic activity, but then there's also if I turn to a civic platform, can I really trust that it is what it says it is? And in fact, one thing that really jumped out at me in the report was that in one case, they basically went and publicized it and said, like, look, the opposition can't be trusted with your data, which was quite striking. So I'm gonna turn in a second with another question to Bill, but before I do, just a quick heads up to those of you who are watching. Please don't forget to submit your questions at askac.org, and we're gonna turn to those in just a couple of minutes, but would love to hear from you. We have a lot of expertise in this panel and many topics on which I am sure they can enlighten us further. So staying on the topic of cyber and turning for a second to Bill, based on what we just heard from Andres, how would you kind of characterize where Venezuela fits in a comparative spectrum in terms of its cyber capabilities, and what recommendations would you provide to citizens and to activists to maximize their digital security to the extent that that's possible when you have some of these zero-click exploits that seem like they may be very challenging to resist? And then where might there be a need for international allies to kind of come in and try to help fill that gap?
Great question. Well, I think in terms of Venezuela's cyber capabilities, they have pretty sophisticated domestic capabilities in the sense of being able to obtain private information from people and being able to exercise social control through surveillance essentially. In terms of technical sophistication, I'm not sure I'd rate the technical sophistication as very high, in the sense that I don't think they're using some of these, super complicated, technically advanced zero-click exploits, for instance, to go after mobile devices. Mainly probably because they just don't have a supplier of that. But I think they're definitely, should those capabilities be available to them, they would be very interested in that. But I think, just in terms of the integration and the wide extent of the surveillance apparatus, I would say, specifically on the cyber side as well, they have a pretty sophisticated capabilities to do a number of different things, like these phishing attacks Andres was talking about, where they can use their Chinese deep packet inspection system to modify unencrypted or unauthenticated web requests to redirect users to, they visit the legitimate page, you redirect them to a phishing page. So that is, I think, a pretty interesting and pretty clever, relatively sophisticated in terms of, a tactic. But technical sophistication, I'd say, is fairly low. Doesn't necessarily matter though, given that they're dealing with sort of a population of devices, which is probably, on the older side, might not be running, the latest version of Android. Maybe it's an older device that stopped receiving Android updates if it's a mobile phone. So you don't necessarily need like the latest and greatest tech. But given their position, I think they have built a fairly sophisticated surveillance and cyber apparatus. The fact that people might be running these older devices makes it tricky to defend against these sorts of attacks, right? Because some of the usual advice is, well, update your device, make sure you're running the latest version of Android or Windows or iOS or whatever operating system you're using on your device. But if your device is end of life, meaning it's no longer receiving these updates, I mean, you can't really, abide by that advice, right? Get a new device might not be economically practical. The new devices you have access to might be, already at or approaching end of life. So it's tricky to give advice in that sense. I think, to the extent that local users in Venezuela are using platforms that are, sort of headquartered in the United States or in the West, those platforms and the governments, I would hope, are working aggressively to try and detect and counter abuse of the platforms or targeting of the users by the Venezuelan government. For example, right, the Google form that Andres mentioned, getting those sorts of campaigns proactively tracked by the vendors whose platforms are being abused and shut down is important. So I think the responsibility here, there is definitely a responsibility here for the tech vendors given that, people in Venezuela might not be able to implement the sort of standard digital hygiene or best practices because the devices are old, they're end of life, they don't have the latest security features.
Thanks. A sort of challenging situation for sure if the economic realities and then the advice you would normally maybe be giving in this situation kind of come into conflict. Andreas, is there anything you'd like to add on this question? I know the report makes a number of recommendations in terms of what activists and citizens in general should do in order to operate in this environment of heavy surveillance. So would you like to share a few of those maybe?
Of course, in addition to what Bill mentioned, which is absolutely critical, and software updates are essential for the protection of the content of your devices, both in case your device is taken by authorities or in case the government attempts to install spyware on them. It is important to increase the awareness of the different forms of surveillance so that people can take appropriate actions. It's very hard to motivate people to take those precautions if they're not aware, but also to do that in a way that also is not like doing the government's work of creating fear in order to prevent all type of civic action, just because people then become they feel the lack of agency they might get from overwhelming sense of surveillance. So what we have been doing, and it was part of the project while we were doing this research, is creating a little bit more targeted training materials in order to improve people's privacy. For example, for the risk of device checks, especially ad hoc ones that are like on the street without sophisticated data extraction devices, stuff like reducing the amount of sensitive information on your phone with things like deleting messages, self-deleting messages, which is a critical tool for reducing the amount of sensitive things you might have on your phone, but you are not tracking, or it's not clear in your head, minimizing things that might get to you while you're already out and about, or while the phone is in the authorities' hands, like maybe controlling notifications or getting out of certain chat groups while you're on a sensitive situation, and also using features such as WhatsApp's hidden and protected chats, which leave practically no evidence of this, like let's say secure folder of additional conversations. Well, they're hidden in a way that there's a lot of plausible deniability that you actually have those chats on your phone, because the way you unlocked it is with a special password on the search field. So there's no like, hey, unlock here button that a policeman will say, hey, unlock this for me, because now I can see that you have like a secure folder for specific chats. So those kinds of obfuscation, reduction, and minimization of data practices is one of the things we have been focusing a lot recently. But also there are other threats that are harder to mitigate if you don't understand how that technology works, including CCTV, but also like cell phone location tracking, and giving tools to activists and how, like, well, if you want to avoid being tracked, you might have to leave your phone behind sometimes, or put it fully on airplane mode, not just, I don't know, like there are a lot of misconceptions depending on the target audience, and we're trying to work with them so that they can more fully protect themselves from this overwhelming surveillance, especially for more targeted groups such as activists.
Thanks for those extremely practical recommendations, and again, encourage everyone to take a close look at the report. Staying on the theme of pathways forward, I want to turn again to Gina and think a little bit more about the role of international human rights bodies in this context. So as we look at documenting, monitoring, responding to this kind of tech-enabled suppression of assembly rights, are there steps that the international community can take to deepen its understanding and awareness of these types of violations in particular, make sure they're kind of not an afterthought? And also as a kind of corollary to that, the report also mentions in a number of places, how there may be targeted types of harassment, and in particular, the interaction with the Patria system that may disproportionately affect women. So how can the human rights bodies take those into account and respond?
Yes, so currently monitoring the human rights violations and impacts on pervasive surveillance is very incomplete because it's mostly centered around the rights of privacy and the data management, and in some occasions in relation of the curtailing of the freedom of expression. But this analysis needs to be extended to include the compound harm of the use of surveillance in a wider list of rights, not only the rights that are in my mandate, freedom of assembly and of association, but also in the report that I will be presenting, I account for the affectation of the right of participation, but the right to health, the right to education, and some other on others. And then this analysis need to also be, we always have an intersectionality lens. Also, it's very important that the international bodies start treating differently the different types of technology that is being used to survey, but always thinking on the ecosystem of surveillance. Because if you tackle only, for example, the use of spyware, but then you still have a lot of cameras and facial recognition, and those are more accepted and more widely sustained, then at the end we are having the same response, but with just different type of technology. So at the end, we need to see all the ecosystem as such. It's also essential that international human rights bodies ensure that any human rights monitoring and risk and impact analysis related to digital surveillance incorporates analysis of the chilling effects. Because the search assessments should consider risks and impact not only linked to the concerned surveillance tools, but also the legal, political, and social context where they are implemented at the entire surveillance ecosystem. Because at the end, it's not the same to have a city full of CCTV cameras or with facial recognition and all other biometrics in an authoritarian country like Venezuela, like in another country that could be a democracy and could have more and different ways to actually fight against the misuse of surveillance. And also, this is like a complex analysis that needs to be installed. One general message I received in the research for the report and the study that it was mentioned is that the people will say, we don't know if we are being surveilled, so we assume we are. And this is something very problematic because this is a normalization of the surveillance that not only reduces the energy of the people, especially activists, to understand the different texts being used, which is something that Andres were mentioning before, or somebody else were mentioning before. It reduces the stamina also to fight against it, because if at the end it's always going to be there, why do I care, right? And then also it reduces the opportunity or the capacity to take more precautions. So all this makes that the winning for who is surveilling is so easy. And at the end, we need to keep pushing for stopping the normalization of surveillance, especially when this surveillance is being used to reduce the possibility of people to express dissent and to participate, for example, in protests. Proactive and systematically monitoring and documenting of evidence is very pressing. And how, for example, perceived surveillance impacts the behaviors and actors of people to join and organize assemblies, but also to mobilize for other, like not political issues, online and offline, for civil society organizations and activists to seek resources or to convey freely their messages. So it's paramount that international human rights bodies and all the community document how these rights are affected. And then, for example, how specific affectations are being are affecting generally the exercises of other rights. One issue is the constant need to change devices, for example, for several activists, or the increased digital security that have a cost also. then who is covering those costs in a moment of a dramatic reduction of financial support for civil society and human rights defenders? So at the end, we need to also link the different trends that we have that are actually affecting the possibility for people to exercise their activism and their acts of human rights defense, on how this is also connected with the surveillance and the bigger pressure that surveillance creates in certain contexts and for specific people, like, for example, activists. And also, it needs to be a lot more reporting on digital intimidation, stigmatization, and criminalization on activism and protest. And even though in the relation between the surveillance and the use of surveillance and the increased excessive use of force against protesters and state violence against activists. So these relations need to be made more clear. I hope that my report put some nuances on that, but then we still need some information of it, but still need to build more. So this is why this report it's so important.
Thanks very much. I want to pose a few questions that came in through the chat before we wrap this up. And so one is just about the device searches, whether those are kind of random stops of people at checkpoints or targeted searches of activists. Andres, I know the report mentions both of those, but if there's anything more you'd like to say about the circumstances of device searches, please feel free. And then there's a second question. I'm going to synthesize a couple of things a little bit about the just the element of transnational repression. So this report primarily focuses on the repression of Venezuelans in country, but if Venezuelans have been abroad, if they criticize the government abroad, if they were attempting to seek asylum, does this surveillance follow them and perhaps affect them or their relatives if they return?
Sure. So on the end of device searches, indeed, we have seen both. At different checks on the street, often the police don't even know who you are, so it's completely random. Then it comes like after protests or in the context or in the vicinity of protests, it's a little bit more targeted because there's like an intention of finding out who was part of it or who is coordinating, who is coming from or planning to go to the announced activities. And then you have when people are detained, where the device is also checked sometimes under similar levels of sophistication, but on completely different context. And then the device is checked, and sometimes, as you mentioned, then the devices are imaged with devices such as Cellbrite, where you get a full record of everything that's on the phone, WhatsApp conversations, and everything. On airports, the things tend to be a little bit more targeted, and a new trend that we saw early in this year is to mitigate a little bit of the proactiveness of some activists and civil society members and journalists of having a lot more digital security hygiene on their devices. A new trend we start to see is policemen or other agents checking your name. So they ask you for your ID or your passport, and then on their own devices, they Googled your name just to see if there's anything interesting about you. Then they could use as an excuse for arresting you, extorting you, or doing other searches afterwards. So taking into account how people were proactively taking care of what devices were on their phones. On the side of the transnational repression, I think it has things to add, but I can add myself that definitely, especially activists who had to leave the country for their own security, they have felt that surveillance, especially online surveillance, and they have felt multiple times how authorities are trying to access their own social media accounts or their Gmail accounts while being abroad.
Any of the other panelists like to come in? Iria, please.
Yes, in the issue of transnational repression, although, as you say, this report is focused on what happened in Venezuela, we had some soft evidence of surveillance and activists who are outside the country. Some of the most obvious ones are the flow of pictures of political leaders or civil society activists who are in exile in their private lives in the countries in where they moved to. We are seeing it's common for the the ruling party officers to present in social media or in television pictures of exiles, political exiles, in having lunch in a restaurant, taking their children to the school. So it's like they want people to know, even though you left the country, you are still within reach. We know where you live. We know where your children go to school. We know where you meet with friends. We know where you practice sports. So, and they continue to provide those pictures constantly in order to make sure people know that. There are cases in which there have been more severe attacks against exiles, like the recent case of the uh, attacks against two civil society activists in Bogota, in which they were severely wounded, or the assassination of a former military officer in Santiago de Chile, in which some of the investigation after the events indicated that these people may have been under surveillance in a more targeted way, more by Venezuelan authorities in those countries. So more and more in the size of physical surveillance, in some cases maybe also intersection of communication for those people, but that is harder to really confirm.
Thanks very much. So I think we are getting to the end of the discussion. I want to quickly thank this fantastic group of panelists and above all, the report co-authors for looking at this. So Gina, in your last point, you mentioned the need for kind of looking at the ecosystem of surveillance and not just kind of individual technologies in isolation. And I think this report does a fantastic job of putting that on the table and helping us to see this as a whole. Aria, I'm going to direct the last question to you, and then feel free to go straight into the closing. And it's a question about looking ahead. So as we heard at the outset of this discussion, it is a time of dramatic change in Venezuela, and a lot of people looking to see in what direction things are going to go. And so specifically with regard to the surveillance technologies and the levers of tech-enabled repression that we heard about here today, what are some of the indicators that we might look for that would point to positive developments in terms of moving away from this environment of suppression, chilling, threat, lack of trust, and toward a more democratic opening? And what are some of the factors that you see as playing into that?
Well, first, I want to emphasize all the surveillance apparatus we described and discussed in the report and have been talking about in this conversation is fully in place, is intact. Nothing happens. The removal of Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd, it didn't affect the system. The system is still working as it was before, with a few cosmetic changes. I mentioned, for instance, the funding of the CESPA, but a person who used to be the head of the CESPA and also the head of the political police is now the Minister of Defense. So there is some move around the pieces, but the pieces are still working. So the surveillance camera continue to survey people. The Patria system is still gathering data. The intersection of communications is still happening. The cyber patrolling is still happening. As Andres mentioned, the device seizures on the street is even at a higher level than it was before. So all the surveillance apparatus is still working, is still in place, and that is because Delcy Rodriguez needed that to control the country. She needs for two reasons. She needs to prevent civil organization. She also needs to protect herself from other competitors in the ruling coalitions. So that is becoming even more critical. at this moment of transition to have a way to control the population and control activists and control political leaders. Ways to seems to look as a path to dismantling of this system uh, had to do in some cases with legal change. So it would be a long way to repeal the law against hatred. It basically is used to criminalize the expression of political opinions. So, under the application of the law, hatred is criticizing human rights violations, criticizing ruling party corruption. That is hatred. And people have been in jail and continue to be in jail because of the application of that law. That in the law legal space, that would be a good signal of change. But even more practical, immediate actions like allowing audits to the surveillance system, to the Bank 9/11 system, so international organizations can see how that data is being collected, allowing audits on the Patria systems to see how the data is being processed. Those will be signals of advance, allowing civil society organizations, both national and international, to look at those at the process in which the different streams of surveillance are being collected, processed, and used. It will be an important signal. Having the political police being restructured in order to make their operations more compliant with even Venezuelan constitution, guarantees and rights for the citizens, it will be a signal to look forward. So some of these things will take a long process to dismantle. So dismantling a surveillance process, a surveillance system takes time. It's not like a switch. We were talking about, for instance, eliminating the censoring of the websites is pretty easy. It's something they just need to make the decision and act on it. But dismantling a widespread system of surveillance like this will take several steps. And even more difficult than taking down the technical aspects of this is removing the distrust, having the people recover the ability to organize and to express freely and to go to the streets exercising their right to public assembly. It would take more time because those chilling effects we were talking before and the damage that caused to the social fabric in a country who have been under this kind of system for over 20 years now. So it will be a process, but that process is necessary in order to go toward a democratic transition. So some people are arguing, when Venezuela became democracy, then the surveillance system will be dismantled, and the censorship will be dismantled, and the disinformation and propaganda system will be dismantled. That is not the way it will happen. So you need to dismantle this surveillance system in order for people to really have the opportunity to fully exercise political rights, and then the process of transitioning toward a democracy will start. And that is something I really want to emphasize as the main takeaway from my intervention in this, and is one of the main takeaways of the report. Actually, the international community, human rights organizations, international and multilateral institutions should be looking to persuade the current authorities that is the path they need to look if they wanted a normalization of the relations with the rest of the world. So they had to start dismantling these systems and making possible for Venezuelans to exercise civil and political rights as the Constitution guarantees. With that, I think we are closed. I will thank you, Beth, for helping us to go through this report with your excellent moderation, and I will thank Gina Romero, United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom Assembly and Freedom Association, and Bill Marsad, Senior Researcher from Citizen Lab, for being here with us, with my co-author Andrés Aspurro, Executive Director of Conexión Segura y Libre, all our team in the DFR Lab at the Atlantic Council, who have been a lot of effort in getting this exhaustive report on the way this Venezuelan surveillance system works and the implications this system had for democracy in Venezuela, but also how this picture of the Venezuelan system may be helpful to understand how surveillance is carried out in other authoritarian countries. So I think that would be one of the goals from this report and for this research, is to help Venezuelans to overcome the surveillance system they face, but also help the international experts to understand how these kind of systems are deployed in very authoritarian, repressive, closed countries. So it's something is hard for international experts to understand and do research in, because they don't have the access. One of the important things, we had researchers on the ground gathering the evidence and looking at the way all these data sources integrate, allows us to provide this comprehensive picture of the overall functioning of the systems. With this, let's thank also the audience who joined us today. Remind that the report will be available at the Atlantic Council website and also at the Conexión Secure website in both English and Spanish. I ask you to download, read, and discuss. That is the goal for all the work we have done. Thank you very much.